I'd like to thank David and his colleagues for organizing this conference. I think it's a very timely and important event. As David mentioned, I am a lawyer. I do specialize in administrative law. That is an area where we deal with regulatory agencies and tribunals. I've worked in a number of areas in broadcasting for many years, since 1983. I've worked both in telecom and broadcasting. And of course, many of these interesting areas involve the CRTC. The CRTC is an independent arm's-length agency created by Parliament in 1968 to look after broadcasting in Canada and all of the parliamentary goals that Parliament decided broadcasting should meet. There are, sorry, I'm just trying to sync these two little things. The CRTC has 13 full-time commissioners. These are chosen by the federal government for terms of up to 5 years. We don't know how they choose them. We don't know what their qualifications have to be, but they are there and we always have to deal with them. They have many staff, several hundred at times, but only CRTC commissioners can make CRTC decisions, and that's why it's always interesting to know who they are and where they come from. But I won't be telling you that, so that'll be my little secret for the moment. We had already addressed, I think, a few issues in broadcasting. The one that will be on the agenda this year is going to be the concentration of media in Canada, thanks to Shaw's attempt to purchase Can West. We also have the loss of local TV news, that's already been mentioned, loss of local programming, the control of new media through ISP throttling. These are all major issues. I'm still working on this. I'd like to deal first, or perhaps even exclusively, with the issue of concentration of ownership. The CRTC has allowed ownership in broadcasting to become very highly concentrated because it usually grants the applications that broadcasters have to file in order to acquire new companies. But the main reason that's given, which is that audiences are fragmented, don't usually tell us what happens after the fact, after we've allowed the concentration of ownership. And what happens is that revenues are not fragmented. 7 companies now receive almost 9 out of every $10 in broadcasting. So if there's a fragmentation problem in audiences, it's not showing up in the revenues. The problem we have is that even though concentrated ownership was supposed to build big entities that could support small, weak stations, we've had quite a few station closures. So concentration of ownership has failed to achieve the very laudable goal of keeping our sector strong. This only shows TV station closures. What we don't know is how many TV stations have been converted into what are effectively news bureaus, rather than originating stations that actually hire people and stay on the ground and serve the local communities. We also don't see much in the way of support for local news. As concentration has increased, we have seen a substantial decrease in local news. This chart deals with local private over-the-air TV stations. Since 1989, the amount of local news carried per week has been cut by 40%, and in the last year by almost 30%. This is a problem. You might think that local private radio would pick up the slack, but the CRTC stopped regulating local news and radio years ago. Many radio stations don't offer news after 6 p.m. If there's a crisis in a local community, many stations are automated through computers. People may not be able to pick up the news in time to act. Concentration of ownership has not helped us in this particular area. As stations have closed, as the news has been cut, we've seen job losses. The little red bars are the cuts in jobs in broadcasting alone. The white represents newspapers. The point in combining 2 of them is if we're losing jobs in broadcasting, there are also not many jobs available all of the time in newspapers. This means that one of the very important industrial objectives of broadcasting, which is to promote employment, have high-paying jobs that strengthen our economy as a whole, is not being achieved. But perhaps one of the worst things about concentrated ownership is that we created all these giant companies because only big companies can create more Canadian content for us. Well, the only little problem with that is that, as this chart demonstrates, the amount of original Canadian content has decreased while concentration of ownership has increased. In 1999, there were 189,000 hours of new Canadian content put on the air. That has now decreased to 160,000 hours. Meanwhile, to meet their Canadian content exhibition regulations, they are carrying more repeats. Now, I don't know, many Canadians seem to like original content, so my concern would be with concentrated ownership that allows more repeats is that Canadians are going to turn to original foreign content. And then we have the final problem, which is that, okay, even if we're cutting Canadian content, maybe we're spending more to make it, therefore hiring more people and getting higher quality programming, therefore whatever the argument is. Unfortunately, that's not working because here the red line is the one that's going kind of down. That's the Canadian content following years of concentrated media ownership. Foreign content is now where it was almost 30 years ago. It's 40% higher than Canadian content spending. So we are almost back at the beginning with the CRTC. The problem is that the CRTC still says that all of these problems can be fixed by the marketplace. This is what markets used to look like. Many buyers and many sellers. In fact, many of you are probably familiar with Adam Smith's invisible hand of the marketplace. This is where it was all supposed to take place. But this is not what we have today. We do not have a marketplace. We have an oligopoly where the top 6 companies in cable serve 88% of all subscribers. There's very little choice in that area. I would not call that a marketplace. You have a few buyers competing against hundreds of programming services that want carriage, and programming services are not winning. So then we think about Adam Smith, because we frequently hear about the invisible hand of the marketplace in broadcasting, and what did he actually say? He said monopolies aren't good. Monopolies are bad because they make prices go up. Well, okay, but the Commission keeps telling us we have a competitive marketplace, that's why they've been able to deregulate. So what happened? What has happened then, let's say, to cable prices where they have stopped regulating rates since 1997? Well, in Toronto, the rates have gone up. I don't know if you can see that very clearly, but there are 2 little big dots way on the right. Those are your current rates as of a year ago. This I had to get by calling Rogers in Toronto and faking the fact that I live in Toronto. I don't, I live in Ottawa, of course. Because the CRTC stopped collecting data on what cable companies charge for basic cable in 2005. So we don't even actually know what's happening, and that means we don't even know why the rates are going up. They are just going up. Now, I just said that we don't really know why. Well, that's not quite true, because in fact courts have had to look at this issue. And what they found is that 10 years ago, Ted Rogers and Jim Shaw got together one night in Toronto, as it happens, and they struck a secret deal not to compete against each other when they serve customers. They're now allowed to compete against each other in each market, but they agreed not to. And the only reason this came to light is because Rogers finally took Shaw to court, because guess what? Shaw broke the deal. But the CRTC now, in fact, and I should tell you, the bad news is that Rogers lost. Shaw was able to break the deal, so I don't know if it's good news, bad news. Ted Rogers wasn't happy. The CRTC doesn't care about this case. They don't care about the fact there are these secret deals. In fact, they have been encouraging more closed-door negotiations than ever before. They like the idea of private sector mediation, where companies that can duke it out behind closed doors, and somehow that will serve the competitive marketplace.